Welcome to History Twist, the series where we change one event in history and follow the consequences as carefully as we can. I'm here today with Dr. Deneen and Chandler Foster.
And today's episode is one of the most serious alternate histories we've ever considered because it deals with assassination, political violence, the constitutional order, and the stability of American democracy.
And we want to say clearly at the beginning here, this episode does not celebrate violence, excuse violence, or treat assassination as entertainment. We are not imagining this because we want it to have happened. We're asking a historical question here. What happens when political violence changes the course of an election?
Our point of divergence is July 13th, 2024, in Butler, Pennsylvania. In real history, former President Donald Trump survived an assassination attempt at a campaign rally. In our history twist version, he does not survive.
That single change immediately transforms the 2024 election. It changes the Republican convention. It changes President Biden's choices. It changes the Democratic nomination. It changes the tone of the campaign and perhaps the future of both political parties.
Now, there is a second major twist here. President Biden, facing a grieving and enraged country, decides to end his reelection campaign early. He says he cannot both campaign and serve as the national caretaker during a moment of political crisis.
Yeah, Dr. Deneen set the scene for us. Where is America politically in July 2024?
America is already tense. President Biden is under heavy pressure after a poor debate performance. Donald Trump is the presumptive Republican nominee. The Republican National Convention is about to open in Milwaukee. Trump has not yet been formally nominated at the convention, but everyone expects he will be.
Absolutely. And then the assassination attempt happens. Yes, in real history, Trump survives. In this alternate history, the attempt succeeds. That means that the Republican Party suddenly loses the man that its entire campaign has been built around.
And because this happens before the convention formally nominates him, the Republican Party is thrown into a crisis. This is not simply a matter of replacing a running mate. This is replacing the central figure of the party.
So, the first question becomes, who leads the Republican Party now?
Exactly. But before we get to party rules, we have to imagine the emotional atmosphere. The news breaks. There is shock. There is grief. There is rage. There is fear. And within minutes, rumors spread everywhere.
Yeah, that is one of the biggest differences between assassination in 1865 or 1963 and one in 2024. In earlier eras, people waited for newspapers, radio, or television broadcasts. In 2024, the country processes trauma through phones, live stream clips, social media posts, edited video, misinformation, and instant reaction.
Oh, like edited video and misinformation. You mean like Fox News, right, Dr. Weaver?
Uh huh.
Absolutely. So, the first crisis is physical security. The second crisis is information. Was it one person? Was it a group? Was there a failure in security? Did someone know? Who benefits? Wow. Those questions would spread long before official investigators could answer them.
And in a healthy political culture, leaders would immediately ask people to wait for facts and reject violence. But in a polarized country, many people would reach conclusions first and look for evidence later.
Now that sounds like the country becomes unstable almost immediately.
Yeah, that's true. Not necessarily civil war, not automatically widespread violence, but a profound instability of trust. People may still go to work, watch the news, and vote, but underneath, normal life is a dangerous question. Do Americans still believe that political events can be explained by evidence? Or do they now assume everything is conspiracy?
Now we're going to move to Milwaukee. The Republican convention was supposed to be a celebration of Trump's return. In this timeline, it becomes a memorial convention. Does the convention still happen, Dr. Deneen?
Probably yes, Chandler. It might be briefly delayed or heavily reorganized, but the party would almost certainly continue. A long delay could look like a collapse. The Republican Party would need to show that it can survive the loss of its leader.
And practically, it needs a nominee. Ballot deadlines are coming. Fundraising has to continue. Campaign offices need direction. Lawyers need to file paperwork. Television ads need a message. Voters need to know who's running. But emotionally, that convention would be unlike anything we had ever seen in modern American politics.
It would be filled with tribute videos, speeches about sacrifice, religious language, patriotic music, and repeated promises that Trump's movement will not die with him.
Yeah. But behind the scenes, there would be fierce negotiations because the question is not simply who is available. The question is who has the moral right to inherit Trump's movement?
Now, that is a very different kind of nomination fight.
It certainly is. A normal nomination fight is about ideology, electability, fundraising, and delegates. This one would also be about grief, loyalty, martyrdom, and legitimacy.
Some people would argue that the nominee should be the person Trump would have wanted. Others would argue that the party needs the strongest general election candidate. Others would say the family should have influence. Still, others would say the delegates must decide without being emotionally stampeded.
So, who rises?
Well, Chandler, in our combined alternate history, J.D. Vance becomes the Republican nominee.
Why Vance, though, Dr. Deneen?
Because in real history, Trump chose him as his running mate 2 days after the assassination attempt. That gives Vance a powerful claim in this alternate timeline. Trump had already been moving toward him. Trump's inner circle could say, this was the man in the future he wanted.
And that claim matters. Vance is young, uh, seemingly articulate, combative, and strongly associated with the nationalist populist direction of the Republican Party. He can plausibly present himself as the carrier of Trump's political legacy.
But regardless, he was not Trump. Now, that is both his strength and his weakness at the same time. He can inherit the message, but not the personality. He can inherit the agenda, but not automatically the emotional bond. Trump's appeal is not only policy, but also was performance, celebrity, defiance, and a direct psychological connection with his supporters.
Vance would have to do something very difficult. He would have to grieve Trump, honor Trump, defend Trump's supporters, and still present himself as a viable president in his own right.
Well, who else might have been considered, Dr. Deneen?
Several names. Nikki Haley could argue she is more electable with moderates. Ron DeSantis could argue that he has conservative executive experience. Marco Rubio could argue he has foreign policy experience and a national profile. Tim Scott, as an African American, could offer a novelty and also a more optimistic tone. Doug Burgum could present calm executive competence.
Yes, but in the emotional aftermath of an assassination, the party may not be looking primarily for the safest general election choice. It may be looking for continuity. Vance becomes the man who can say, I will finish what Trump began.
So does the convention really accept that?
Not without tension, but yes, in this version, the convention rallies around Vance because any prolonged fight would look disrespectful, chaotic, and worse, politically dangerous.
So the Republican ticket becomes Vance plus a stabilizing running mate.
So who does Vance choose?
He probably needs someone older, steadier, and more reassuring. Marco Rubio, Tim Scott, or Doug Burgum would be plausible. Nikki Haley would be powerful with the moderates, but she might be too distrusted by the Trump base. Rubio gives experience, Scott gives optimism, Burgum gives calm.
My best guess is Rubio or Scott. Vance needs balance, not another firebrand.
Something I want to talk about here is the martyr effect. Now, Dr. Weaver, you've used the word martyrdom before. You used it earlier, in fact. What does that do politically? A martyr effect can intensify loyalty. When a political leader is killed, supporters may stop seeing that person as nearly a candidate and begin seeing him as a symbol of sacrifice. Criticism of that leader can feel like an insult to the dead. Compromise can feel like betrayal.
And that would almost certainly happen here. Trump's image would become even more powerful among his supporters. His final rally, his last public moments, his slogans, his photographs, his music, these would become political relics.
So Trump is gone, but Trumpism may become stronger?
In emotional intensity, yes, but whether that produces electoral strength is another question altogether.
Why wouldn't it?
Well, because emotional intensity can mobilize supporters, but it can also frighten undecided voters. If the campaign becomes too angry, too vengeful, too conspiratorial, some voters may move away from it.
That is Vance's dilemma. He must honor Trump without making swing voters fear that he will govern as an instrument of revenge.
So Vance has to say, we will continue, but he can't say, we will retaliate.
Yeah, precisely. And that is a rather narrow path.
Now we turn to President Biden. In real history, Biden eventually withdrew from the 2024 race. In this alternate timeline, he does it earlier, almost immediately after Trump's death.
Absolutely. But the explanation changes. In real history, Biden's withdrawal was tied to concerns about age, performance, polling, and party confidence. In our alternate history, Biden frames the decision as an act of national duty.
His speech might sound something like this.
I have decided that I cannot divide my attention between campaigning for reelection and preserving the peace of the country during this grave moment. Political violence must not be allowed to decide the future of the United States. My duty now is to serve as president, calm the nation, protect the election, and ensure the peaceful transfer of power.
And to me, that sounds like a much stronger exit than simply being forced out by his party.
Yeah, it really does. It allows Biden to become the caretaker president, the elder statesman who steps away from ambition to steady the republic.
But we should also notice the word ostensibly. Publicly, Biden says he is doing this to calm the country. Privately, Democrats may also note that his campaign was already weakening. The assassination crisis gives him a noble reason to do what many in his party were already urging him to do. So it can be both sincere and politically useful. Right, Dr. Weaver?
Yeah, Chandler, you're right. And history often works that way. A public decision may have moral, personal, political, and strategic motives all at once.
And Democrats would likely rally around the decision because it lets them reset the race without appearing to exploit Trump's death.
Okay, so let's just say Biden exits here. Who becomes the Democratic nominee then?
Kamala Harris is the most likely answer.
Almost automatically?
Not legally automatic, but politically close to it. She is the sitting vice president. Biden can endorse her immediately. She can claim continuity. And Democrats would not want a messy convention fight while Republicans are uniting around Trump's memory.
There would be other names: Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom, Josh Shapiro, Andy Beshear, Mark Kelly, and some others, all plausible in some version of events. But replacing Harris with someone else would carry some rather substantial risks, I think.
Why would you say that, Dr. Weaver?
Well, because could look like panic. It could also fracture the Democratic coalition. Harris would already be the first woman, the first Black woman, and the first South Asian American vice president. Passing over her in a crisis could produce anger and distrust inside the party.
And the Democratic message in this timeline is stability. You cannot run on stability while holding a chaotic internal fight.
Absolutely. So Harris becomes the nominee because she is the least disruptive option.
Whoa, that's a good way to put that, Chandler. She may not be everyone's first choice in a wide open primary, but in this emergency timeline, she is the cleanest choice.
Now, Harris needs a running mate. This choice becomes extremely important.
Because she needs balance, she needs someone who reassures voters, strengthens the Electoral College map, and reinforces the message of order.
There are three especially plausible choices.
Okay, why don't we go through them, Dr. Weaver?
Okay, first, Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a critical battleground. And in this alternate timeline, it is also symbolically central because the assassination happened there. Shapiro would bring legal, executive, and state level credibility.
Second, Mark Kelly of Arizona, a former astronaut, Navy veteran, a senator from a swing state. Kelly would bring national service symbolism and a calm, disciplined image. He would be especially attractive in a campaign shaped by security, democracy, and national stability.
Well, third, what do you think, Chandler?
Well, third, we have Tim Walz of Minnesota. Tim Walz of Minnesota. Walz brings Midwestern plain spokenness, executive experience, and a teacher veteran image. He may help communicate with voters who feel culturally distant from national Democrats. So, out of those three, who do you think she might choose in our timeline, Dr. Deneen?
I think Vice President Harris chooses Mark Kelly or Josh Shapiro. In real history, other calculations mattered. But in this darker timeline, the country is obsessed with violence, security, and trust. Kelly's biography becomes extremely useful, and Governor Shapiro's Pennsylvania connection also becomes extremely useful.
Yeah, I lean slightly towards Mark Kelly. He offers disciplined patriotic symbolism and swing state appeal without making the campaign feel entirely centered on Pennsylvania.
Okay, so Harris Kelly is your most likely Democratic ticket here, huh?
Yeah, I think Harris Kelly versus Vance Rubio or Vance Scott is where we're sitting.
Now the campaign becomes something completely different from the real 2024 election.
Instead of Biden versus Trump, it's Harris versus Vance.
And each candidate represents a different emotional answer to the assassination.
Vance says Trump's mission must continue. They tried to silence this movement, but the people will answer at the ballot box.
Harris says violence must not decide elections. Democracy must continue. The Constitution must hold. And America must reject revenge.
And to me, that sounds like two completely different understandings of the same event.
Exactly. Vance frames the election as an inheritance. Harris frames it as restoration.
Vance's strongest argument is emotional and populist. Trump gave voice to people who felt ignored, and now his supporters must complete his work.
Harris's strongest argument is institutional. The country is in danger, and the next president must defend constitutional order rather than deepening the crisis.
So, why exactly does Vance come for Harris? What exactly does he attack her on?
He would argue that the Democrats spent years describing Trump as a threat to democracy, and that this rhetoric created a dangerous political climate.
Harris would respond that political disagreement is not political violence. She would say that no one is responsible for the assassinations act except the person who committed it, unless there is evidence which proves a wider plot.
I think that debate would dominate everything.
Do you really? Yeah, it could. Every campaign speech would be judged by whether it lowers or raises the temperature of the country.
Now, we have to talk about conspiracy theories again here because you know as well as I do, they would be everywhere, Dr. Weaver.
Yep, they would be unavoidable.
Yes, sir.
Some people would blame the government. Some would blame Democrats. Some would blame foreign powers. Some would blame security of agencies. Some would blame Republicans who benefit from Trump's death. And some would claim that the official story is impossible before investigators even release their findings.
Historically, assassinations often produce conspiracy thinking because the emotional size of the event feels too large for a simple explanation. People struggle to accept the reality that one person, one failure, or one chaotic moment can change history.
But in 2024, the internet will supercharge that. False claims would spread faster than corrections. Videos would be clipped out of context. Old photographs would be misidentified. Fake documents would be circulated. Form disinformation networks might amplify whatever divides Americans the most.
And this would not only be a media problem, it would be an election problem. If millions of people believe the assassination was part of a hidden plot, then they may also believe the election itself is illegitimate no matter who wins.
So, Harris and Vance are not only campaigning against each other, they are campaigning inside a collapsing information environment.
Yes, that is correct. And whoever wins inherits that collapse.
The campaign trail itself would change immediately.
Yes, they would. No more ordinary outdoor rallies.
At least fewer of them. Security would become much more restrictive. Rooftops, sight lines, entrances, drones, Local police coordination, press areas, and crowd movement would all be scrutinized.
Both campaigns would look less spontaneous. More indoor events, more controlled settings, more televised addresses, more careful screening.
Now, would that hurt Vance more than it would Harris?
Possibly. Trump's politics thrived on rallies. If Vance is trying to inherit Trump's emotional rally culture, tighter security could make that harder. Harris, running on order and stability, might be less damaged by a more controlled campaign style.
But Vance could also turn restrictions into a political symbol. He could and probably would say, they are afraid of this movement, so even security becomes political.
Everything becomes political, Dr. Deneen.
Yeah, you're really right about that. In this timeline, especially, even caution is interpreted as a message.
Now, let's get concrete here. What does the map look like here, the electoral map?
The basic partisan map still exists. Harris would likely carry strongly Democratic states: California, New York, Illinois, Washington State, Oregon, most of New England, Maryland, and others.
Vance would likely carry strongly Republican states, much of the South, the Plains, some of Appalachia, and many rural states.
So the race comes down to the battlegrounds: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and North Carolina.
Does Vance make Ohio competitive?
Ohio probably stays Republican. Vance, being from Ohio, helps him there, but Ohio was already leaning Republican by this point. The more interesting question is whether Vance can carry Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin by appealing to working class voters who liked Trump.
And that depends on how well he translates Trumpism without Trump.
What about Miss Harris? Now, she has to hold the Democratic coalition together, all while presenting herself as a national stabilizer. Quite a challenge. Her challenge is to win voters who may have doubts about her personally, but fear a politics of revenge under Vance's rule.
If Harris chooses Mark Kelly, Arizona becomes more promising. If she chooses Governor Shapiro, Pennsylvania becomes more promising. If she chooses Walz, as she did in our timeline, the Midwestern message improves.
Now, which states decide that?
Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin remain central. If Harris wins those three, she likely wins the election. If Vance breaks through in Pennsylvania and one of the other two, he has a very real path.
All right, here. Prediction time. Who wins this alternate election?
My best estimate, Harris wins narrowly.
I agree, but I would stress the word narrowly. This is not a landslide. This is a bitter, tense, disputed in spirit election, even if the legal result is clear.
Why Harris?
Well, there's three main reasons.
First, Vance inherits Trump's movement, but not Trump himself. A movement built around a charismatic leader often struggles when the leader disappears. Supporters may remain passionate, but they do not always transfer their loyalty perfectly to the successor.
Second, Biden's early exit helps Democrats reframe themselves. Instead of looking like a party trapped behind an aging incumbent, they become the party that says, we put country over ambition.
Third, after an assassination, many swing voters may prioritize calm over ideological excitement. Harris can present herself as the candidate of constitutional order.
But can Vance win too?
Yeah, he could. Vance wins if the martyr effect overwhelms everything else. He wins if Republicans unify very quickly. If Harris appears unprepared, if the economy is hurting, or if voters accept the argument that Democrats helped create the climate that led to Trump's death.
He also wins if he does something hard and controls his tone. If Vance runs as a grieving but disciplined heir, he is much stronger. If he runs as a passionate, angry avenger, he may energize his base, but he will lose crucial swing voters.
So the election may turn on temperament.
Yes, that's true. The other thing is that Vance does not have a very good track record in terms of presenting himself in debates, although he has been noted in some places as being articulate. I think he is not, in my opinion. Well, not as articulate as most any other prominent person. So, in a crisis election, voters are not only asking, who do I agree with? They're also asking, who will keep the country from breaking?
A vital thing. Our projected result: Harris wins the popular vote by a few points and wins the Electoral College narrowly, possibly by holding Michigan and Wisconsin and winning either Pennsylvania or Arizona.
But the country does not feel settled.
Nope. The election ends the campaign. It does not end the crisis.
Let's follow the Harris victory path first.
All right, let's do that. What happens the morning after, Dr. Weaver?
Well, relief for Democrats, fury among many Republicans, and uncertainty everywhere. Harris gives a victory speech calling for unity, condemning political violence, and promising full transparency in the investigation.
Vance faces an enormous choice. Does he concede clearly? Does he challenge results in specific states? Does he say the election was legal but morally distorted by Trump's death? His response shapes the next 4 years.
Well, would he concede? In our most stable version, yes, he would, but with very sharp language. He might say, we accept the constitutional process, but we do not accept the political forces that brought us to this moment.
That kind of concession preserves his future while keeping the movement energized.
Well, what about Trump supporters?
Well, many would not accept emotional closure, even if courts, state officials, and Congress certify the result. A large number of people may believe the election was unfair because Trump was taken out of it.
That becomes the central myth of the post 2024 Republican Party. Not necessarily the votes were changed, but that history itself was stolen.
And that is powerful.
Very powerful. A stolen election claim is procedural. A stolen history claim is almost spiritual. It says the future we were meant to have was taken from us.
So President Harris takes office under extraordinary conditions.
Quite extreme, I would say. She's the first woman president elect in her own right, but not in a celebratory atmosphere.
Exactly. Her presidency begins under the shadow of assassination, conspiracy, security failure, and national mistrust. There would be celebration among her supporters, but the mood of the country would remain tense.
Her first priority would be national stabilization. That means supporting the investigation, protecting public officials, reassuring our allies, and just trying to lower the political temperature.
Would Congress cooperate?
Partially. There would likely be bipartisan support for investigating the assassination and reforming security, but everything else would be contested.
What do you think, Chandler, would happen with the Secret Service?
Well, Dr. Weaver, the Secret Service would almost certainly be reorganized or heavily scrutinized. Congressional hearings would be intense. Campaign security would expand. Major candidates would receive more protection earlier. outdoor rallies would become more restricted. Now, do you think there would be new laws, Dr. Deneen?
Likely. Some would focus on candidate protection, monitoring of threats, and coordination between federal and local agencies. But civil liberties groups would worry about surveillance and overreach.
Yeah, and that is one of the biggest long-term consequences. Political violence often produces a security expansion. The challenge is preventing that expansion from weakening the very democracy that it claims to protect.
So let's talk about Vance and the Republican Party here. So, if Vance loses, what happens, Dr. Deneen? Is he just finished or not?
No, I don't think so. In fact, he may become the central Republican figure after Trump.
Yeah, he's young, nationally known, and seen by many as the man who carried the banner after Trump's death. Even in defeat, that gives him some symbolic power.
But would Republicans blame him?
Some would. The party would split into factions.
One faction would be the Vance wing, populist, nationalist, more policy oriented, and determined to turn Trumpism into a lasting governing ideology.
Another faction would be the Restoration Wing. Republicans who say the party must move beyond Trump's controversies and personality and rebuild with suburban voters, business conservatives, national security Republicans, and moderate independents.
And the third faction would be the martyr wing, activists, media figures, and voters who believe Trump was taken from them, and that compromise dishonors his memory.
Now, if I have to say here, that third wing, it might just be the most volatile, Dr. Weaver.
Yes, martyr politics can keep a movement alive, but it can also prevent adaptation. It may make every disagreement feel like betrayal.
So the Republican Party survives, but it does not settle. It enters a post Trump identity struggle with Trump's memory more powerful than ever. We should also look beyond the United States.
Yes, we should. How would the world, not just the country, but how would the world react to this, Dr. Deneen?
Allies would be deeply concerned. NATO countries, Israel, Ukraine, China, and Russia, and others would watch to see if the United States can still conduct an orderly election after an assassination.
Foreign adversaries might try to exploit the crisis through propaganda. They would not need to invent divisions. No, they would simply amplify the divisions that we already had present. So, misinformation becomes a national security issue.
Yes, indeedy. If Americans cannot agree on basic facts, foreign manipulation becomes so much easier. I sort of familiar with that.
Now, if Harris wins, the Allies may see continuity but worry about domestic instability. If Vance wins, Allies may prepare for a sharper shift in American foreign policy, especially on Ukraine, NATO obligations, trade, and relations with authoritarian powers.
So, either way, the assassination weakens America's image.
Yes, even if the election proceeds legally, the world sees a country under severe internal strain.
Now, what are some of the cultural consequences of all this? What happens culturally?
The assassination becomes a defining national trauma. It is replayed, argued over, memorialized, commercialized, politicized, and mythologized.
Just with 9/11 and the Kennedy assassination in our time, there would be documentaries, books, hearings, anniversaries, memorial rallies, all sorts of lawsuits, investigations, and endless arguments over what it really meant.
Well, do you think schools would teach it?
Eventually, yes. But even teaching it would be contested. Some curricula would frame it as an attack on democracy. Others would frame it as the martyrdom of a populist leader. Others would focus on security failure, national polarization, or misinformation.
And families would argue about it. Workplaces would avoid discussing it. Friendships might fracture over it. It would become one of those events where people ask, where were you when you heard?
You know, I'm one of those people, like with the event with Kennedy or 9/11, I always like to ask, where were you when such and such happened?
In terms of national memory, it would be thought of that way. But unlike the Kennedy assassination, this would occur in a much more fragmented country and media environment. There would never be one shared story. There would be competing realities from the beginning. Oliver Stone would probably make a film about it.
Yeah. Okay. Let's summarize our most likely timeline.
July 13th, 2024. The assassination attempt succeeds. Donald Trump dies, and the country enters immediate shock.
The Republican convention becomes a memorial convention.
After intense behind the scenes negotiations, Republicans nominate J.D. Vance as the heir to Trump's movement.
Vance chooses a stabilizing running mate, likely somebody like Marco Rubio, Tim Scott, or Doug Burgum.
President Biden announces that he will not seek re election, saying the country needs him focused on governing, calming tensions, protecting the election, and preventing political violence.
Democrats rally quickly around Vice President Kamala Harris to avoid a damaging nomination fight.
Harris chooses a running mate who reinforces steadiness and swing state appeal, most likely Mark Kelly or John Shapiro in this timeline.
And also in our alternate timeline, the general election would become Harris versus Vance.
Vance runs on legacy, finish Trump's mission.
Harris runs on constitutional order. Violence must not decide democracy's future.
And the campaign is tense, heavily secured, filled with conspiracy theories, and watched nervously by the world.
Our best estimate is that Harris wins narrowly, especially if Vance cannot fully control the anger inside the movement he inherits. But Vance remains powerful, perhaps becoming the central figure of the post Trump Republican Party.
Now, this is a darker history twist than usual.
It is, but it shows something important. Assassination does not solve political conflict, it multiplies it.
It turns campaigns into memorials. It turns candidates into symbols. It turns investigations into national obsessions. It turns elections into tests of whether people still trust constitutional processes.
Absolutely. And in this timeline, both parties, both parties lose their original candidates.
Yeah, and that is the central twist. Trump is removed by violence. Biden removes himself, claiming national duty. The election becomes a contest between successors.
Vance represents inheritance. Harris represents continuity. Both are shaped by the trauma that created the race.
And even if Harris wins, the country is not healed.
Holding an election is not the same as restoring trust. A democracy can survive a crisis and still carry the wound.
The lesson is not that one party benefits or the other party benefits. The lesson is that political violence damages the entire system.
It changes not only who runs, but what the election means.
And that is why political violence must be rejected clearly, consistently, and without partisan exception.
Quite true.
Absolutely.
For History Twist, I'm Dr. Sean Denis.
And I'm Chandler Foster.
And I'm Dr. Weaver. Join us next time when one changed event sends history down a very different road. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.